Vez had watched several of the Seventh Snake's replays and was impressed with what he had seen. The mech pilot's flamboyant piloting of the Seraphim showed remarkable mastery of its capabilities. The Seraphim dominated the skies. It fought particularly well against other flyers and launched aggressive attacks against opponents on the ground. Though Vez knew little about mech piloting, he still recognized the Seventh Snake's remarkable skill. His aggressive playstyle and continuous risk-taking demonstrated his keen sense of timing. If Snake wasn't already on the threshold of being promoted to silver, he was absolutely in the upper tier of the Bronze League. When Vez saw that the Seventh Snake was online and had entered matchmaking, he decided to spectate the match. What he saw of the young pilot's performance had reaffirmed his previous judgment. Snake piloted the Seraphim in ways even Vez hadn't imagined. But does he have the X Factor? Good piloting didn't necessarily mean the mech had the X Factor. Even if he disregarded the phenomenon's vague definition, the X Factor might not even work in a virtual reality environment. Perhaps the Seventh Snake was a good pilot and nothing more. Still, Vez believed it would benefit his understanding of his own mech if he spoke with him. When Vez initiated a call, the mech pilot answered immediately. "Hello, I saw you spectating my last match. Who are you?" "I'm the mech designer who created the Seraphim variant you're piloting." "Whoa," the pilot gasped. "No wonder I thought your nickname was familiar. So you're the famous Fantasia customizer?" "I'm researching a new project, and I was hoping for some feedback from the people who pilot my other work. Can you spare a moment of your time?" "Yes." Vez was taken aback by the Seventh Snake's enthusiasm. This was the first time since he had become a mech designer that someone had afforded him any level of respect. "Okay, thanks. I just want your thoughts on some stuff. It's not formal or anything," Vez told him, hoping he hadn't paralyzed him into silence. "Let me ask you something. Your records show that you've been piloting the Seraphim ever since you bought it. What made you stick with the model? I think you must have realized by now that it isn't the best mech in its weight class." The Seventh Snake paused as he tried to formulate his words. I can't describe it. I never thought about replacing my Seraphim. I love it too much to get rid of it. The mechs that I've piloted before are all good machines, but they don't fit my style." "What do you mean when you use the word style?" Vez asked, wondering if it had anything to do with the X Factor. "My play style, my way of fighting. Something like that. The Seraphim just clicks with me in a way no other flyer does. It's like we're on the same wavelength. I can feel my passion take over the entire mech when I'm engaged in a fight. No other mech makes me feel this good." "All right, let me ask you something else. Have you ever experienced a moment where your mech gave you a push? For example, has the mech warned you of danger when you were unaware of it? Have there been any moments when you thought doing something was impossible, but you still managed to achieve it because your mech gave you a helping hand?" The Seventh Snake was silent for a moment. "I don't think I've had any moments like that. I'm always in full control of my mech. What I do know is that I feel more at ease with the Seraphim than any other mech. It's easier to play at my best when I'm piloting the Seraphim. I bought your Phantasm and Nomad models, but I couldn't get quite as comfortable with them. Maybe it's the lack of wings. I've fallen in love with flying." Vez asked the Seventh Snake some other questions. What he thought distinguished a good pilot from a great one, whether mechs were better being smaller or larger, and whether he believed in metaphysics. The young pilot's answers revealed no surprises. The boy wasn't aware of the X Factor, nor was he pursuing anything magical. Through their conversation, Vez formed an image of the young potentate. He seemed young, wealthy, and well-trained. His view of the mech world had been colored by the many teachings of his tutors. It was, therefore, no surprise that he had never heard about the X Factor. Presumably, his teachers had concluded that he had no business chasing a fantasy. "I have one last question," Vez said, wrapping up the interview. "Take a moment before you answer this. Do you believe your mech is alive?" I don't know," the Seventh Snake replied with a confused expression. He tried to recall the times he had piloted the Seraphim. I mean, of course it's not alive in a technical sense. The Seraphim's a great mech, but it doesn't have any AI, as far as I know. What I can say is that piloting my Seraphim makes me feel more alive than anything else. All right. Thank you for taking the time to tell me about your experiences. Goodbye. I hope I helped. You certainly did. Can I ask you something before you go? Are you gonna put more one-star mechs on the market? Vez shook his head. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't plan to. I've sold most of my one-star licenses, so I can't construct any new one-star mechs. Besides, my hands are kind of full trying to start up my real universe mech business. Oh, so you're a real mech designer? No wonder. That's not to say I don't have a use for Iron Spirit. Vez responded carefully. He didn't want to say that earning massive amounts of DP was his main reason for sticking around. Once I earn some revenue, I want to transition to 2-star mechs. The profit margin is better in that tier. He also wanted to work on expanding his limited customer base beyond Cloud Curtain. In a few months, he'd hopefully have enough skills to produce a competitive design. Vez shut down the game, stood up, and stretched his limbs, mentally re-examining the interview. The seventh snake had spoken with a peculiar accent that reminded him of the officials who worked in the capital. Despite his good upbringing, the young potentate had described his piloting in the same way as the veterans had when it came to the incredible feats that some had associated with the X Factor. In other words, the interview had provided inconclusive results. Vez was no closer to understanding the elusive X Factor. Is it some kind of energy within a mech? Is it some evolutionary catalyst that manifests in only a couple of pilots? But there was one thing all the interviewees had in common. Love, affection, grief, vengeance. Whatever the case was, most of the extraordinary performances mentioned on the galactic net were backed by strong and unrestrained emotions. It seemed unrelated. After all, Vez couldn't see what emotions had to do with mech performance. It was like suggesting that an air car would fly faster if the driver felt happy or angry. It made no sense. But an air car doesn't have a neural interface, Vez muttered. He wondered if that was a clue. The neural interface allows mech pilots to receive sensory input from the mech. It lets them treat the frame like it's their own body. Any decision a mech pilot makes is sent as output through the same interface, causing the mech to move according to their commands. Vez went back to his terminal and found a few articles about the neural interface. It was a highly restricted and controlled piece of hardware. Under no circumstances did any manufacturer allow the neural interface to leak unnecessary signals. Excessive sensory input would overload a pilot's brain, while excessive movement output would cause the mech to lose control. The neural interface was strictly programmed to detect and block unauthorized signals, and technicians checked them frequently to ensure they weren't tampered with. Every mech designer and technician trusted the neural interface to work as advertised. If thousands of industry insiders are sure there's nothing fishy with the neural interface, then it can't be the source of the X Factor. Emotions also elicited brain signals, and since those were different from the sensory and movement signals, they were explicitly blocked by the neural interface. But what if those signals are inseparable? He wondered. Could emotions be conveyed through the same signals, therefore making it impossible for the neural interface to filter them out? He wondered, for example, if a mech held a sword above a fallen enemy, whether its pilot's desire to kill the opponent blended with the signal that commanded the mech to thrust the sword down. Or if a mech spots missiles flying in its direction, does an emotion like fear accompany its sensor signals about the incoming threat? Unfortunately, Vez had no background in the neural sciences. All he had learned about the neural interface in college was how to install and maintain it. A designer didn't need to understand how the gadget worked to use it in their designs. But unfortunately, that meant Vez was unable to answer the questions he had. Some really intelligent people have chased the X Factor. If a layman like me can think about the possible connection of the neural interface, I'm sure they've exhausted themselves to death trying to discover whether it's capable of doing more. In the end, Vez was still stuck, with no solid theory on how to achieve the X Factor. He had no starting point for a design that could incorporate it. With the huge interest payment deadline looming over him, time had begun to run out. He couldn't waste the remaining days on a fruitless quest. Lucky chose that moment to wander inside. With a nonchalant look, the mechanical cat dropped some shiny blue sapphires at Vez's feet. The cat nuzzled his legs with its slim body. "Another gem," Vez said. "At least you didn't bury it in the backyard again." He picked up the sparkling blue gem and inspected it briefly before storing it in a small safe. "Good job, buddy." Vez took a break. He picked up his gem cat and sank onto the sofa. He scratched the cat's metallic hide, not really sure whether the cat could even feel his fingers, but it acted as though it did. Lucky closed his eyes as he lay down comfortably on Vez's lap. As Vez looked at Lucky, a thought entered his head. "Are you alive?" he asked the cat. The cat kept purring as if he didn't understand the question, but Vez knew the gem cat was smarter than he looked. He possessed AI that was far more sophisticated than the thoughts of an average household cat. What is life? The age-old question had caused a lot of controversy over the years. Many scientists had determined that life required the ability to learn, adapt, and reproduce. Those clinical definitions encompassed all manners of life, including the tiniest bacteria, but its definition was far too broad to be of use in Vez's present situation. Instead, he wondered whether Lucky could be called a living being. Sure, he probably couldn't mate with another mechanical cat, but he was essentially no different from any other pet. Whether Lucky's responses were formed spontaneously or through a large script of possible responses didn't matter. Humans worked the same way, which anyone could see if they pulled out a microscope and looked at a person's cells and DNA. I don't care what the scientists and experts say. Since you're capable of expressing your emotions, you're alive in my book. Vez was certain the key to unlocking the X Factor lay in emotions. If Lucky could express love, hate, fear, and disgust, why couldn't a mech do the same? Certainly, according to scientists, mechs didn't possess the programming to ferment thoughts. But what if a mech could bypass the neural blockade? It could borrow the pilot's complex neural system to form its own emotions. Since the mech was connected to its pilot's brain neurally, its emotions would mirror the pilot's feelings. A mech's anger would reflect its pilot's own hostility toward an opponent. That would enhance the pilot's current mood and show anything abnormal in the neural interface. I'm kind of reaching here. How can a novice designer like me get it right when countless experts have missed the connection? But by that point, Vez had stopped caring about the opinions of others. He decided to keep it simple. Lucky is alive. The system is also a living being. If those two entities are capable of life, then I believe that mechs are too. He knew that if he said those words to one of the researchers who had studied the X Factor for decades, he'd be laughed at and ridiculed. It was a stupid argument that relied entirely on subjective, anecdotal experience. But when he looked down and stroked Lucky's back, he felt no regret. I can't rephrase it any better than that. But my faulty logic doesn't matter. It's what I believe. My heart tells me I'm looking in the right direction, and that's good enough. Vez had finally obtained a somewhat coherent picture of the relationship between life and the X Factor. He felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Now, I have to put the theory into practice. Vez was ready to design a new mech, one that would hopefully unlock the X Factor.